Well, the real question isn't so much about democracy. It's how to present an oligarchy from emerging and taking what should be basic needs and turning them into essentially monopoly rent extraction. My book is really about the contrast between today's finance capitalism in the West and the industrial capitalism that seemed to be evolving into socialism a century ago. But basically, the book of lectures is about the privatization of credit and debt, because that turns out to be the most important political question of our time. And it's also about land rent and other forms of economic rent as unearned income. High prices that are not reflecting actual costs of production. They're a kind of tax levied by the rentier class at the expense of society. And that's why I have David Harvey and Boris Kargalitsky here to discuss what rent extraction is and why the whole fight of free markets in the 19th century was to free economies from land rent, monopoly rent, and financial rents from control by the wealthy classes so that governments could actually plan society in a way that provides overall prosperity. For this summary, I want to discuss the political implications for democracy and oligarchy, the political wrapping of today's finance capitalism and US foreign policy that's trying to impose itself on the rest of the world. It seems bizarre that American diplomats call this financialization a fight of democracy against authoritarianism. It's finance capitalism that's turning out to be the central planning of our day. It's the banking system that allocates credit, and it does so in a way that inflates prices for real estate, for stocks, and for bonds, and loads economies down with debt, which makes them high cost and therefore non-competitive. The United States is the most financialized economy in the world. It's used its financial credit creation to increase real estate prices, to increase the cost of living, to increase the cost of education, to increase medical care. And the result is that American labor can't compete with foreign labor. That's resulted in, instead of trying to cut the costs and do what 19th century industrial capitalism did, and that's get rid of the false costs of production, the economic rent and finance. They're insisting that other countries financialize and that other countries load their own economies down with economic rent. And if they don't, they're not called democracies. They're called authoritarian. Authoritarian means resisting the pressure of US diplomacy to try to financialize other economies. So the economic and political tension of today's world is how can a high-cost, polarizing economic system fighting to maintain its dominance using an Orwellian rhetoric of free trade, democracy, and free markets for a system that's actually just the opposite? Well, the real question isn't so much about democracy. It's how to present an oligarchy from emerging and taking what should be basic needs, food and housing and education and healthcare, and turning them into essentially monopoly rent extraction. That's the strategy of rentiers throughout ages. The creditors and landowners tried to turn their economic power into political power to control government and lawmaking. And so it doesn't matter whether there is a seemingly political form where people get to vote. As long as they're not able to vote on anything that really determines their economic policy, it doesn't matter whether you let them vote. You let them vote against things that don't matter economically. And that's that you could say that's the American economic system and Western democracy in general today. It's not democracy in any meaningful sense of the word. Political democracy is about who gets to vote. But that's not the same thing as economic democracy. If the votes of the majority of people count less than those of the oligarchy, then it's only a democracy in superficial form. In the United States, they've done tests to see what people want. The vast majority of Americans want universal public medical care. There's no way they can get it through the political system. They want student debt to be written down and written off, and so that everybody has an access to education without having to go into a lifetime of debt. No way of getting that. No political party supports that. So you have in the United States an inability of the population to get any of the issues that really matter: debt, housing costs, retirement income, Social Security. None of this is part of the democratic political process, because the rentier interests, the donor class, the wealthy class, controls the political party's nomination process and who gets nominated. So we're having sort of a sham democracy, as it used to be called in the 19th century. And the fact is, this was the case ever since antiquity, ever since Greece and Rome. You could say it's a problem of Western civilization. Well, if we think of democracies in terms of policies that benefit the majority of the population and prevent oligarchies from emerging, then Western democracies don't look very successful. The first great success comes from what might be a strange place: the Near East Bronze Age, the monarchies of Sumer and Babylonia in this 3rd millennium BC, the 2nd millennium BC, and later Near Eastern realms in the 1st millennium BC. Only the strong palatial economies were able to resist the emergence of an oligarchy taking control for themselves and imposing austerity on the rest of the economy. Now, I want to say a word about the Bronze Age Near Eastern monarchies. That might be a strange thing to talk about when you're talking about democracy, but the fact is that down through Roman times, they prevented a creditor class and a landlord class from emerging to rival the palace and gain control of the labor force. The whole purpose of controlling labor, if you were a creditor, was to get it into debt and make it work off its debts, to work on the landlord's own land, and to pay the crop surplus, not to the government as taxes, not to the palace, but to the landlord, who would end up with labor to really create their own army. And when they did that, when they got the population into debt, that prevented the smallholders from working on corvée labor to build walls, to build public projects, and to serve in the army. So rulers tried to prevent this from developing. They prevented labor and land from being diverted away from public obligations, away from working on public projects and paying taxes, by proclaiming clean slates, that is, debt cancellations, returning the land to the original debtors who held it, and sort of returning the economy to the way it was before it ran into debt, which usually took about a generation or a rule.
历朝历代，开国之君都要推行均田免赋，对吧？只要你真的实现了均田免赋，一个稳定的200年的朝代大体上是能成立的。而运行到一段时间的时候，一定是豪强大族占田，对吧？所以怎么改革中兴，那就得有大臣站出来议豪强。如果议豪强的被豪强干掉了，豪强的利益很大嘛，最后在朝廷有影响嘛，把他干掉了，那这个朝代就走向尾声了。如果中兴成功了，议了豪强了，那这朝代又再发展一段时间，对吧？
Every new ruler in Sumer, Babylonia, and the ancient Near East would start the reign by proclaiming a clean slate. They're going to cancel the debts. They're going to free the bond servants from having to work on the land of the creditors, and they're going to return any land that had been forfeited or sold into distress. Well, classical antiquity didn't have anything like Bronze Age divine kingship, where the few places where there were local kings, they were overthrown by oligarchies. Politically, the Greek states called themselves democracies, but economically, the oligarchy was in control. Well, one result was a decline of city-state finance. Cities ran into debts, and they had to borrow from wealthy people. The wealthy class broke free of taxes, And the states had to end up borrowing from them and pledging their marketing arcades, their land and their markets, and the public property was privatized. It's as if Margaret Thatcher got in a time machine, went back to Greece and Rome, and made things the way they were in England after the 1980s or in the United States after Ronald Reagan. Well, one of the things that the oligarchies did in antiquity was to block public spending. They didn't want the state to be responsible for providing public services. They wanted the wealthy to provide public services and to be able to charge for this.
我是谁?
So like conservatives today, they wanted small government. They wanted the poor to become dependent on creditors and to owe them labor and to forfeit their land to landowners who made huge estates, latifundia, that concentrated land ownership. And they also used violence to murder popular leaders who wanted to do what the Near East had done. Throughout antiquity, there were riots century after century urging debt cancellation and land redistribution. Rome had the secession of the plebs numerous times. They had the revolt of Catiline, finally the murder of Caesar, and finally in North Africa, the revolt of the Donatists against the Roman Church that had supported the landlords. Rome said, well, let the wealthy people give charity to the deserving poor. The deserving poor, meaning people who didn't criticize the way in which they organized society in their own self-interest. And Rome bequeathed the kind of pro-creditor law to the modern world that we're still in. We're still in the kind of oligarchic rule of law that was based on the sanctity of contracts that permitted creditors to act against the public economic interest. And there was no longer any public override to interpersonal contracts that ended up concentrating land ownership and indebting the population at large. So the real question isn't so much about democracy, but it's about how to prevent an oligarchy of creditors and landlords from monopolizing the economic surplus by forcing the economy into debt, having to pay private creditors, and essentially taking over the economy for themselves.